preachers. A society was, you have to think of it this way. Most churches have a board of trustees. They handle the finances of the church and worry about the building and so on, right? That's exactly what a society did. A brand new entity invented about 1810. It was an entity whose business it was to handle the financial side of religion. And the church handled the spiritual side. And that's exactly the way they thought of it. So societies appeared in those towns that had stopped paying for paying any money to the churches. And these societies then met regularly and found a way to raise money by donations, by sales, by whatever means available, by soliciting from their fellow citizens, whatever means available. They had the financial obligation. Such societies were formed in the 1810s with the idea that someday in the future it's probably going to be impossible to find any government support for religion and morality. So we have to have an instrument in play, or a concept at least. So the possibility of creating these things was created by the legislature. Towns created them. And for the next 100 years, almost all congregational churches in New Hampshire had this dual structure. There was for every congregational church, and for many others, Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist as well, for all congregational and for most others, there was this dual face. There was a society and a church. The church found a minister. The society agreed that that was the minister, and for the church to hire, and these two worked in tandem, like a board of deacons and a board of trustees. So that's when that got started, at the time when we were about to lose support for religion. Well, we then come to 1820. Actually, technically, it's 1819. But that's the point when the whole tax issue and tax support for religion and churches and piety and morality came to a head. And that was the Toleration Act, one of the most famous laws that New Hampshire has passed and one of the most cited and referred to. Despite the fact that there was an enormous amount of debate prior to 1819 on the wisdom of finally withdrawing public support from religion. That is, despite the fact that there was this enormous debate, and there were cries of doom on both sides. One side said, you subtract public support from religion. That, supposing you were to subtract public support from education, you think you'd have an educated citizenry then? No. If you didn't have tax support for education, who knows what would happen? If you don't have tax support for churches, who knows what would happen? There was real concern on both sides, because on the other side there was this view. You know, once the churches are freed from being, in effect, run by the selectmen, once the churches are freed from the obligation to please everybody, the churches will be liberated to prosper. So those were the two sides of a very intense argument that took place for a decade before 1820. It will be the liberation of religion, it will be the end of religion. Much doomsaying on both sides, big issue. Very seldom has New Hampshire faced bigger, more complex issue. Now, it seems like a no-brainer to us today, but in that day, the idea that the government supports religion was as axiomatic as it was that the government supports education. In 1819, the law, what's called the Toleration Act, was passed. That law, in effect, said nobody may be taxed for the support of an organization which he has not voluntarily joined. That's the gist of it. Nobody, and that's the gist of the law today. Nobody may be taxed for the support of an organization which he has not voluntarily joined. That means that, you could, among other things, and then you couldn't tax Baptists to pay the Presbyterian, or to pay the congregational minister, because, you see, by this time, 1820, there are Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians all over the place. And they're all being taxed, and they're all complaining about the fact that their tax money is going to a congregational minister, because it just so happens that 90% of the towns in New Hampshire had congregational pastors because of the history. So the law said, another way of putting it is this: the law in effect made what was earlier required, namely that the town by its taxes must support the church, required, made that which had been required forbidden. The town may not support the churches with its tax funds. So that was a huge shift with all kinds of miscellaneous consequences, but there's no doubt that, at least in my mind, there's no doubt that nothing more important for the Congregational Church was happening than at that time, in 1820, than the issue of church and state and the passage of the Toleration Act. Now, I mean, both the naysayers and the alarmists beforehand, had some reason for saying, yeah, you see, we told you so. And the others could say, yeah, well, we told you so. One saying that it was going to be the end of religion, and the other saying that it was going to be the liberation of religion. Probably the liberation is won that argument to some extent. Religion, in fact, did not die out in New Hampshire, as the doomsayers said. And indeed, other things intervene, so that it's very, very difficult to detect exactly what was the sole consequence of the Toleration Act, and what was the result of other things that were going on at the time. So before you draw too rigid a conclusion about whether it's being totally beneficial or totally unfortunate, you have to bear in mind that lots of other things are going on too at that time. For example, so now what happened, I'm going to move on to what happened thereafter. For one thing, many of the Congregationalist ministers said to themselves thereafter, it really is good to be relieved and to have the selectmen relieved of the obligation to monitor what's happening in the churches and to apportion the tax money fairly. For the selectmen, it was a huge relief that they no longer had to deal with this issue of how to apportion the tax money and with the complaints that they got from people. A huge relief. But also, the selectmen were no longer in charge of the church. The selectmen in most of these towns before 1820, and certainly before 1800, made decisions on such things as where shall the choir sit in church. This is in records not only of Washington. There are many instances in the town of Washington, but in other towns as well. The selectmen made decisions like that, or the town meeting made decisions. The town meeting hired the pastor. Before the advent of the distinction between society and church, the town meeting had a vote on whether or not to hire a pastor. And the town meeting had a voice in the question: the pastor wants to resign, shall we let him resign? Town meeting vote. So after 1820 and the Toleration Act, many said, what a relief to no longer be under the jurisdiction of the selectmen and the town meeting in order to run the affairs of the Congregational Church. Great liberation. So they really had something there. At the same time, the other side of the argument had something too, namely if you withdraw government support, it's going to be a very difficult and challenging task to keep the church in good shape and pay all the bills and pay the minister. And frequently what happened is that the congregational minister took the beating on that one because the society didn't have very good strategies and no experience at raising money. You know, at public fundraising, you know, we take for granted it's going on all the time. It wasn't going on all the time then. There weren't, I mean, it wasn't a cash society. It was a barter society, basically. So these new societies whose business it was, I'm using the word society in two ways, society as a community, but society as that organization whose job it was to raise money. These societies had no experience at fundraising. They solicited funds. They got a row of people to agree to contribute $2 to the pastor's salary. But they didn't collect that $2 when it was pledged. No, they had to go back and collect it, and the man could say, well, we just don't have any cash at all. We won't have for a month. It was a hugely challenging problem for these societies to raise enough money to keep the church in and indeed, in some cases, to build a church. That's what was happening in the 1820s. What I want to do now is to slide all the way to 1840, but to summarize what I think is important about what was happening for the congregational churches at that time. What I've just been saying was that the churches, in effect, had brand new difficulties that they hadn't experienced before, fundraising. They also had something else, though. New Hampshire was growing. New Hampshire was much more prosperous after this period than it had been before. New Hampshire was a farming set. It was a set of farming communities carved out of the wilderness, and that had been basically accomplished by 1820. The trees had been cut, the fields had been tilled. The second generation of farmers and the third generation of farmers were far more prosperous and by comparison richer, not necessarily in cash but in stock and somewhat in cash, than the previous generation. So New Hampshire is growing and is prosperous. There's more people, more money. It's possible to do more things, even though these little societies in each of these little congregational churches and each of the little other denominations churches, they're having difficulty raising the cash because we haven't really become still a cash society. But certainly far more things are possible. And the other thing that's important is at this time, we have to go back and think of what is it that these congregational churches are worshiping in. They're worshiping in basically meeting houses. Between 1750 and 1800, hundreds of meeting houses were built on the very same pattern, basically. They all look the same at that time. Those that remain don't all look the same today, but then they did. All of them were oblong boxes. 90% of them were without towers or steeples or bells or clocks or anything. Oblong boxes, painted blue, green, orange, yellow, or whatever, but not white, because they were built before they could really afford to use white paint. These buildings are now heavily worn, and they're worn out, and they're clumsy and awkward, and there's that pulpit way up on the north side, and then there are the doors on the south side, and there's a gallery on the east side, and a gallery on the west side, and a gallery on the south side. They're all mirror images of each other. In fact, each building is totally symmetrical. I'm talking about almost all of the meeting houses, 95% of the meeting houses that were built between 1750 and 1800. And now we're in the 1820s, and these things look a little awkward. They've got all of these sort of benches, calf pins, as it were, kind of benches. So they're all the same, and they're all worn, and they've all been used for 50 years and haven't been necessarily kept in good repair. So you've got people who are looking for somewhat different style of worship, a somewhat different manner of conducting the church. They aren't concerned about discipline problems anymore. The tax issue has been settled. Their meeting house is worn out. There is more prosperity in the community. What's going to happen in that environment? Well, many things are, but the thing that strikes me as being interesting that happens is a kind of explosion of interesting new architecture within the congregational churches, and also, by extension, in many of the Methodist and Baptist and Presbyterian churches as well. So in the environment of the Toleration Act changing things, the new prosperity and the sense of boredom with those not very interesting and rather chilly old meeting houses, you suddenly have appearing on the scene almost from nowhere a brand new kind of church architecture.